Okay, today we have a very special guest, a hero of the Jewish community and people that are supporters of Israel and, frankly, sanity in a world that seems to have gone a little bit insane. Jonathan Sacerdoti. Is it Sacerdoti or Sacerdoti?
Sacerdoti is a good
Sacerdoti.
English approximation.
Okay, great. Always want to make sure I pronounce the names of my guests correctly. He's a journalist, broadcaster, and has really been fighting the good fight for Israel and for morality in the public sphere, in journalism, in politics. Recently saw Jonathan appear on I was about to say famous, but really infamous parliamentary. I think it was a select committee recently where they kind of faced this, Jonathan and Natasha Hausdorff and others faced this kind of show trial, and I want to discuss that and unpack what happened. So plenty of things to discuss in the news at the moment, the Iranian arrests, and what's happening with Hamas and the protests in Gaza and what's going to be in the future there in Israel. So I really want to get your insights on all of that. But the first thing I decided to ask you, which someone actually asked me recently, and I thought, it's such a great question to ask people, is what do you feel is the thing that we're not talking about that needs to be talked about? Something that's on your mind that's not spoken about enough that you want to raise in people's consciousness.
Well, firstly, it's great to be with you, Ollie, and congratulations on everything you do with JTV. And I'll say that in answer to that question, it's a good one. What is it that I don't think we're talking about enough? It depends who we are. I think that we as Jews often are talking about things that some other people aren't. But I'll give you a couple of answers. One is for what we maybe aren't talking about as a Jewish community or as Jews in the UK. And the other one is what maybe we as a broader society aren't talking about. So I'd say that Jews aren't talking enough about worst case scenarios. I think it's natural that we sometimes talk about whether things have got too bad and what we might do if they have, but we keep it quite quiet. And I think we have a tendency, even if we think it or discuss it in the privacy of our own homes, not to really take it seriously enough. And I say that really not to be alarmist. I'm not one of those people that's said that every few years, but I do feel increasingly from listening to other people, and I get a lot of people writing to me from the UK and around the world, telling me how bad they feel things are, and individual stories, anecdotal stories that really make me wonder, actually, should we be thinking a lot more and talking a lot more about the possibility of having to have alternative plans to those we might have liked? And I'm sorry, that's a depressing one. And the other one I'll say is, what are we not talking about enough outside the Jewish circles, in broader circles? And I would say that it's related but different, which is we're not talking enough about the threat to Western civilization, to our society, to our freedoms, our liberties, all the things that we maybe took for granted all of our lives because we grew up, people my age and younger grew up in a place where these things were not questioned. They seemed automatic. They seemed like defaults. But actually, I think that there are many challenges to them now from various places, and perhaps we'll get onto some of those later. But I think we need to talk a lot more about how those freedoms that we've always enjoyed and assumed were always going to be here actually aren't free. You sometimes have to pay quite a lot for them in your fight.
Well, I'd like to unpack that a little bit just to really get into the heart of this. So let's talk about first what you said about the Jewish community and worst case scenarios. You're talking specifically here about the UK. And I think JTV's audience actually it's a big chunk is British, but actually an even bigger chunk is American. So I think this will be really insightful. I was just speaking to some Americans. I was across the pond recently, and they're really curious and want to understand what's they hear things and see things in the media about what it's like to be a Jew today in Britain, but they don't really get a sense of what it's like on the ground. And I kind of feel like the situation is a bit unpredictable. Like, it's hard to know which way things will go. And on the one hand, it still feels like, to be a British Jew has a great deal of benefits and privileges. But on the other hand, we've been getting like an accumulation of things that are making us feel uncomfortable. But when you say worst case scenario, What are the kind of things you're talking about that you feel are the most alarming, that could make things most particularly difficult for Jews in Britain down the line? Are you talking about the way Israel is treated in media and politics? Are you talking about demographic issues with regard to particular communities? What do you mean when you think about worst case?
Well, I think it's all related. And I'll say that this also does apply for America and Jews around the world. I hear a lot from Jews in all parts of the world, and they often share quite a lot of fears and concerns. And often it's private, or they might share it with someone like me because they've read my columns and they feel that I maybe have some advice to give, or I'm not quite sure why actually some of them write to me, but I'm always touched and honored that people do, because it's definitely interesting to hear what other people think and sometimes to have those conversations. What exactly I'm talking about is really hard to say, and that's part of why I think it's difficult. It's intangible. And I gave a speech recently for Holocaust Memorial Day, and it was published in The Spectator on Yom HaShoah a few weeks later, about the promise of never again. And what I said in that speech is that history does repeat itself, but it doesn't come out the same. It rhymes. So we don't necessarily know what it will look like. We're not talking about yellow stars and jackboots and swastikas. That's unlikely to happen again. But there are other things that are happening right now that I think are just as worrying for some people as some of the signs back then might have been in the early days, that society and politics were shifting. And I literally hesitated to say that, because I don't like to make those comparisons. And as I often say, I often mention my late father, who was a Holocaust survivor, because that, I think, is what rooted me in this place where I've always been keenly aware of what's going on around me, and the ramifications and the implications for Jewish people and wider society, perhaps because of his story that he told me all his life. So I think that if I'm to try and give you some specifics, there are many things that I've heard of. I've heard several cases, for example, of people who've had to remove their children from British schools because there was a level of anti-Semitism that the school failed to deal with, to the extent that the parents moved their children. Now, I think that's really worrying. It's not a state-sponsored or state-instigated piece of anti-Semitism. And so some people say, well, so it's not so bad, it's a one-off case. But when you hear several of these kinds of anecdotes from different people's lives in different places, you realize that it doesn't have to be led by the state. In fact, governments and politicians often follow where the people want them to. And so the more that those sorts of things are happening in ordinary day-to-day life and society, the more I think it's then going to be reflected in politics. And so that takes me to the next step, which is, in politics, we do have something to worry about. In the last election here in the United Kingdom, we saw the phenomenon that I think there are 5 independent MPs who were elected according to what was called the Muslim vote. It was an actual campaign group who put those people forward to beat mostly Labour, or maybe all Labour Party candidates in those seats, basically dividing the electorate on issues that they felt were resonant with Muslim communities, with Muslim voters. And specifically, they used Gaza as a sort of dog whistle, because it is a dog whistle. It has no relevance to British politics, but that was the sort of passwords, the code word that they used, the shibboleth. So I think that's the point, is we saw in that these 5 people elected and then form a sort of informal caucus within Parliament. So what effectively we're seeing is the birth of a Muslim, Islamic, political, almost party in the British Parliament. I think that is notable. Whether or not one thinks that is cause for concern or not, that's a personal reaction, but I think it's definitely notable. So anecdotal things in society leading to actions in politics, and other actions in politics, such as not stopping the constant and regular hate marches, as Suella Braverman called them, but these very, very loud and aggressive anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian terrorist marches that have gone on again and again and again. And just last week, the police in London allowed, on a Friday afternoon, as people are getting ready for Shabbat in Swiss Cottage, an area with a lot of Jews. In fact, I was passing through it to go to Friday night dinner at some friends. This massive protest, vicious, angry protest against Jews. They say it's against Israel. They say it's not pro-terror, but there's a smell test. I think when you go past these things, you can see what's going on there. So they've banned it now. They've banned it from happening again in that area from this week, but they sort of tested the waters by allowing it last week. So all of these things, I mean, these are just a few examples. Then you look on campuses, you look at the recent Stand With Us polling and research that came out yesterday was quite widely covered about the university campus experience of many Jewish students in the UK. And again, not just that they experienced anti-Semitism, but that their universities didn't act sufficiently well to stop it. They didn't protect them, they didn't look after them. So we end up in a place where our national broadcaster, the BBC, has alienated many or most Jewish people and spreads and tells lies and calumnies about Israel. We end up with the police not necessarily doing a good enough job in many Jewish people's eyes to protect them. We end up with portions of society regularly taken to the street with unbridled and unabashed, unveiled anti-Semitic statements and actions, making Jews afraid to go to those places at those times. We end up with politicians reflecting that. And gradually, we end up with a society where Jews feel less comfortable. And none of that had to happen by the election of a Nazi party or the implication of laws in the country which were overtly and specifically anti-Jewish. It all happens sort of legitimately, by default, organically. And that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And it sort of feels like, or it felt to me, when some of these things will start to happen, you think, well, maybe that's just the exception to the rule in British society. And there's still a part of me that feels that way. But as you said, it's like an accumulation. And the more things happen a bit more, you start to think, is this really the exception to the rule? And it kind of leads to...
And that's why, by the way, I say that these are things that we need to talk about overtly. And I spend an awful lot of time in my writing and speaking, talking about those things very, very boldly, outright. I just want to put them out there straight, because I do agree with you that there's probably a large portion of, probably a majority of British society, which if it thinks about these topics at all, it is quite largely against this slide in that direction. And yet they don't need to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. As I said, many Jews don't want to talk about it. It's a horrible thought. So I think that if we talk about it, we're much more likely to try and do something about it. But if we don't talk about it and we just say, as you said earlier, many of us feel our lives day to day are very nice. We can go to synagogue, we can go to kosher restaurants, we can buy kosher food, we can live as Jews, we can even be, proudly Jewish out in public and mostly live our lives very nicely. And that is a good thing, don't get me wrong. But all this other stuff is still going on. And there is always this fear for Jews that we should leave it a little bit too late, and that it might be too late when we realize we need to do something. So that's what I'm trying to warn about in as calm a way as possible.
Yeah. It's amazing what you say about, the way that it's different to, let's say, in the 1930s and 40s with an elected government. It just really validates the notion that anti-Semitism mutates. It's brilliant in a way. That last time it was an elected government from top down. Now it's kind of from the bottom up, and it's just the story of anti-Semitism throughout history is just this incredible force that always finds a way. I want to touch on this point that you mentioned that I feel is quite distinctly British in not wanting to talk about things. Particularly, you mentioned that, the Muslim vote and the rise of sectarian politics and that being a big demographic issue. The Henry Jackson Society, as I'm sure you know, produced this report or poll around British Muslims, and it found that I think it was like 3 in 4 British Muslims had some kind of denial or kind of excusing of the October 7th attacks. And Douglas Murray was recently interviewed on BBC. I think it was Newsnight, I can't remember. And they were saying to him, I mean, why do you talk so much about these demographic issues? I mean, if you've got a problem with someone like Sajid Javid, who's a British Muslim and he's a Conservative MP and actually very sympathetic to Israel, and it's like no one is saying that every single Muslim is the problem, and it's this ridiculous caricature of trying to talk about a serious issue. Mehdi Hassan himself, the pro-Islamist, anti-Israel journalist, said that anti-Semitism is the Muslim community's dirty little secret. It's not making a racist statement about every single Muslim, but it is stating that there are some serious cultural issues that need to be addressed. And yet, talking about, well, what's the problem with Sajid Javid, is such a pathetic deflection of a very serious issue. And it just reminds me of this point you're saying, that why are we so unable in our society to talk about these important issues, and instead we just suppress it, we deflect, we silence it? What do you think is going on there at like a psychological level?
I did see that Newsnight interview with Douglas, and I've spoken with Douglas about these things. I think that it's a very sensitive topic, especially for Jewish people, actually, because I think that we've been the victims of prejudice and unfair discrimination throughout our history. And so it doesn't come naturally to us to want to criticize other people's beliefs or other minorities' status or actions. But I think that the difference is that sometimes other groups actually do things that are wrong or problematic, and our natural inbuilt fear of doing to others what was done to us might stop us from talking about it. And I think that maybe applies outside those circles as well. So not just to Jewish people, but it's just not done to criticize minority groups or other people's religious beliefs too much. But I think we need to get over that, because if a minority group or a religious belief or set of philosophies and outlooks is worthy of criticism, and I'm not just talking about Islam, I'm talking about any religion or philosophy, we should criticize it. That's the whole point in the freedoms that we have. So if you don't like Marxism, you can discuss openly the problems with Marxism and criticize people who try to push that form of politics and thinking and society on the rest of us. If you don't like Judaism, go ahead, discuss it. If you don't like Islam, same thing should apply. And yet I think that there's a few things at play which stop people doing that. One is what I just described, and the other one is fear. Because quite famously, if you're too critical of Islam, or you do it in a way that is offensive somehow to extreme practitioners of that faith, you stand to be killed or treated badly in some other way. Your personal safety is at risk. So I think there is a great fear of that. And among politicians, there's also a fear of losing votes, because I think there are clearly parts of the country where the electorate does vote according to those identitarian or sectarian lines. So I think all of those things are there. And I really do understand the sensitivities around this. I do understand the difficulties around it. And I never want to be somebody that is criticizing all Muslims or somebody that is racist in any way against specific groups. I think that's important, but I think it's equally important that with those things in mind, we should still discuss these very difficult topics. When it comes to Sajid Javid, I think that was a particularly weird trick that the BBC played in that interview, because he was talking about the idea that Douglas had apparently written or said somewhere that less Islam would create less extreme Islam. And he said, don't you mean then less Sajid Javids and less Sadiq Khans? So making it specific and personal is a problem. But I'll say Sadiq Khan recently did something quite outrageous. I wrote a piece about it in The Spectator when he made that video, I think it was for Eid, in which he decided to wish Muslims greetings for their festival, but he used that opportunity as Mayor of London, elected Mayor of London, to make it political, to have a go at Israel, to effectively and unjustifiably speak about Israel in a way that wasn't reasonable or fair, wasn't representative as Mayor of London of anything, and alienated many Jewish people. So yeah. I think that Sadiq Khan is not immune from these problems and sensitivities either. And I think that trying to pick out people like that is a way of trying to silence people like Douglas Murray. And Douglas, of course, has added an enormous amount to this debate over the years. He's one of the people that first tackled these subjects openly in his writings and in all of his activities. And as a result, of course, he has been very largely targeted by some on the left or some who disagree with him who want to silence him for doing that. And I'm obviously against that.
Hmm. Absolutely. Can you tell us about your experience at this Parliamentary Select Committee? This was one of your articles recently in The Spectator, where I think you wrote about your experience there, where you had Emily Thornberry, who was the head of was it the Foreign Affairs Select Committee?
Yeah.
And she, of course, let's not forget, was on arch anti-Semite Jeremy Corbyn's front bench, and there she was as chief inquisitor grilling you about Israel. Just tell us about your experience there and what it was like to actually be in the room, because many of us saw the viral footage, but to actually be there in person and see their faces, what you felt they were trying to get out of the discussion. Obviously, you were there alongside Natasha Hausdorff, and just tell us a bit about that and how this all relates to everything we've been discussing up until now.
Yes, it's a lovely picture of Emily Thornberry there that they chose. I'll say about that. They invited me to first submit what they call written evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee on this, and they then invited me after that to come and give what they call oral evidence to the committee. Effectively, they asked me to come and give my analysis and my thoughts. The Foreign Affairs Committee is meant to, in my understanding, provide investigation and discussion of British foreign policy, and then to eventually write its findings from each one of these inquiries or investigations up in a way that they can provide it to the Foreign Office and to the Foreign Minister with suggestions and thoughts on British policy. So that sounds like a fairly reasonable thing to do, but I think that in this case, there are a few factors at play. Emily Thornberry, of course, was famously extremely disappointed not to be given a role in the cabinet when the Labour Party won the election. She had been for 8 years in the shadow cabinet, and I think had rather expected that she would be maybe even foreign secretary, but we were blessed instead with one of the dumbest foreign secretaries this country has ever had to suffer, David Lammy, instead. Tough contest there, though, for who would have done a worse job, in my opinion. And I'll say that Emily Thornberry demonstrated why that is so in this committee. She was needlessly aggressive. She was unwelcoming. She was rude, especially to Natasha Hausdorff, who actually was the session before me, but also to me. She basically behaved in a bullying and hectoring way. It was completely clear why. She is personally, virulently anti-Israel. One of the other members of that committee was Abdeslam Mohammed, who had just a few weeks before literally been turned away from Israel in Ben Gurion Airport because they said that she had told them she was there for a parliamentary mission, and they had no evidence or preparation for that on their side. And similarly, they, I believe, do not admit people who are trying to push for a boycott of Israel, and she has been, they said, shown to be doing that. So they turned her around, and she's in this committee grilling me about Israel. It seemed that neither of these two MPs, Emily Thornberry or Mohammed, really knew very much, in my opinion, about Israel from their questions, especially Mohammed. She asked me this strange and hesitant question full of ums about land grabs and the West Bank and settlements, trying to interrupt and suggest that I'm in some way justifying violence. I don't think she was listening to the answers. In fact, as soon as she'd finished with her question, she actually left the room and didn't sit there for the rest of the evidence. Wow. So I thought, again, just very peculiar behavior for people who are trusted to be on the Foreign Affairs Committee and asked to be doing this important work, supposedly. Emily Thornberry, for her part, just kept poo-pooing everything I said. So she kept asking this really weird question, which was, what do you think Gaza will look like in 10 years? It didn't seem very relevant to the mission of that committee, which is, as I said, to critique and suggest changes for British foreign policy on this matter. And when I said that the vision that I think would be good for Gaza would be for it to be de-radicalized, demilitarized, for there to be no ability for it to attack or harm Israel's security in the future, because it's demonstrated that it really wanted to and did do significant harm to Israel. She just sort of dismissed that and said, I've heard all the things you don't want. I've heard all of that, but what do you want? And then when I asked her, did she not share those desires of mine, she appeared to take great offense at that question and gave me this kind of Paddington Bear-like hard stare, this glare, as if to try and, I don't know, scare me. It didn't. I thought it was very telling about her, and she, pushed on with her questions about whether there should be a Palestinian state and things like that. And I really, to be honest, I don't think it makes any difference whether Emily Thornberry thinks there should be a Palestinian state. I don't think Emily Thornberry has a very good understanding of the Middle East or of Israel or of the current war or of the Palestinians or of the history of the conflict between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. At another point, she tried to twist what I'd said in the middle of an answer and say that I was suggesting that all of the Arabs surrounding Israel are its enemies. In fact, I'd not said that. I had to explain it to her. Eventually, she said she understood me. I just found it a really weird experience because it was an example of how little the people on that committee knew about this topic, and yet how strongly they felt about it, to the extent that they were rude to, aggressive to, and bullying of the very people they had invited as experts to give them information and perspectives that they might not have. And I think that was really just, at the end of the day, that was the problem. I think that's why so many people have seen it online and have written to me and written comments and written pieces about how disgraceful their behavior was.
It was both disturbing and encouraging to me at the same time. I'll say why. It was disturbing because it showed the level of ignorance and incompetence at the senior levels of British politics and society, where they're just completely ignorant about so many of the issues that they were getting your thoughts on. But at the same time encouraging because it just gives me more confidence in our positions, because it shows that the opposition to, Israel's case is just based on nothing, basically. I wonder, though, her question to you, where she was really the narrative she's trying to push is that, ultimately, yes, maybe Hamas bad, maybe de-radicalization, yes, but ultimately still the Palestinians are the ultimate victims here. They're the ones that need hope. They're the ones that need a vision. But obviously that's her narrative. But just putting that to one side, do you think there is something legitimate, nevertheless, in asking the question about what Gaza's future looks like, and wanting to say, okay, fine, we'll get behind Israel getting rid of Hamas, but what's the the end goal here beyond just de-radicalization? Because even then, that's still surely just one step along some kind of vision. So do you think there is, in principle, is it a legitimate question?
I don't think it's a legitimate question in the way she was posing it, because these sort of, firstly, why 10 years? What's this weird arbitrary 10 years about? Let's get through this year. Let's get through the immediate aftermath of the Palestinian invasion of southern Israel and the slaughter of 1,200 people and the kidnapping of over 200 and the remaining 21 or 23 who are still alive in Gaza. Let's get through those before we entertain Emily Thornberry's fantasy of what Gaza might look like in 10 years. Her fantasy is no less interesting than Donald Trump's fantasy for what Gaza might look like in 10 years. In fact, Donald Trump's is interesting because he's the president of the United States. Emily Thornberry is a failed would-be foreign secretary of the United Kingdom who, in the comforts of a committee room in the Palace of Westminster, feels that she can bully a journalist who she's invited to come and talk about Israel. There's a bit of a difference in impact and influence there. And yes, by all means, let's talk about what the future is for Gaza. But I was doing, the future for Gaza has to be de-radicalization. The future for Gaza has to be demilitarization. The future for Gaza has to be de-jihadification. If they cling on, if the Palestinians cling on in Gaza or anywhere else to the idea that they have a jihadi desire to wipe out Jews, to eradicate and remove the state of Israel, and to do so through brutal, disgusting means such as rape, kidnap, and murder of civilians, of people in their beds, of people in their homes, if that's their aim, that is what needs to be ended. Before we can even entertain any weird fantasies and thoughts about statehood, who on earth in their right mind would want to give a state to a people who literally just invaded their nearest neighbor, slaughtered them, tortured them, raped them, kidnapped them, continues to do that, and continues to say that it would like to keep doing that in the future, all under the influence of a tyrannical theocratic regime nearby, which is also sponsoring and training other jihadi groups in the region to encircle Israel, to eradicate the Jewish state. Who on earth would want to give statehood to such a people? Now, her point was, surely not all Palestinians are like that. But we're back to the surely not all Muslims are like that formula. It doesn't matter if all of them are like that. And it doesn't really matter if even a majority aren't like that. And there is literally no polling that I've seen that suggests that it's a minority of Palestinian political thought that thinks that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because minorities can be extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
And when minorities act in that way, and when minorities, even if they are a minority, and I said again, I'm not sure they are, have power in a region, not just as the governing force, but any kind of influence that has taught a generation of Gazans to behave that way. I saw civilians on the day behaving that way. We've discussed that many times. Civilians filmed themselves going into Gaza, kidnapping, torturing, killing. Then you have a problem. It doesn't matter if you can find me individuals from a group who don't behave that way or don't like it, because they're not the problem. The problem is that there exists a piece of land called Gaza on the border with Egypt, bordering Israel, from which that kind of behavior regularly happens, which is governed by a group that says unashamedly that's what it wants to keep doing. As long as that is the case, and as long as that people, that area, has the weapons and means to do that, and the support from people around the world to keep doing that in some way, of course, I'm not interested in discussing giving them statehood. It would be to create another terrorist, extremist Islamic state in a world which already has too many of those, and one which is doing extreme damage to Jews, to Israel, to non-Jews, to generally. I don't understand how anyone could say they want me to discuss a 10-year vision of some kind of rosy solution which ignores all of the reality that we're facing today.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent response to this whole question and issue that she was posing. For those who are outside the UK, they may not be aware that there's recently been a whole host of arrests of Iranians in Britain who were linked to potential terror attacks. I was reading there was potential plot. I'm not sure if this has been confirmed. It looks like it has, on the Israeli embassy in London. And you recently penned a piece also in The Spectator saying Tehran's cruelty is closer than we think. Can you just expand on this a little bit for our viewers who might not be so aware?
Of course. So that's what happened. It was on Saturday, I think it was the 3rd of May. There were these arrests made, and it was announced that the police in the UK had made a series of arrests. Counter-terrorism officers had detained 5 men, including 4 Iranian nationals, across various locations in England. So I think Rochdale, Manchester, Stockport, Swindon, and West London. And those individuals were arrested on suspicion of preparing an act of terrorism, which they said at the time was focused on a specific location, but they didn't say what that specific location was. So the Daily Telegraph put out the suggestion that it was a Jewish location, a Jewish place, maybe a synagogue or a Jewish community center or something like that. And then yesterday, the Times published an exclusive. They said they had information that actually specified it was the Israeli embassy in Kensington in London. Now, there was actually another arrest, I don't know if it's related, nobody said, of somebody who was scaling the wall of the Israeli embassy wearing a keffiyeh, and that person had been arrested. So the idea that people are trying to break into the Israeli embassy is not imaginary. And then these arrests of these Iranian-linked people suggests that if the Times is correct, they may have been trying to break into there. Now, that's not unusual behavior for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that's what I wrote about in my column.
Yeah.
The Islamic Republic of Iran, which, for those who don't know, seized power in Iran and governs over a people who predominantly do not support it. It is a tyrannical theocratic regime which believes in Twelver Shia Islam, which is, if you read into it, Google it, read up about it. If you don't know about it, it is an extreme and quite unhinged sounding set of beliefs that there needs to be the end of days, and then the 12th Imam, who is currently hidden, will reappear. But for that to happen, there's going to be massive chaos and presumably war and death. So this state, which has a countdown clock to the end of Israel's existence in public, is making every effort to make that happen. They've also engaged in terror activities around the world for many years, and that includes here in the United Kingdom. So the intelligence services here, I think, have mentioned something like 20 foiled plots that they have managed to stop, which have been orchestrated by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, in the past, there have been other terror attacks, such as Jewish centers in South America, plenty of others. There's been kidnappings. They particularly engage in kidnappings. So Jimmy Shamhad is one good example. He's not British, but his daughter, Giselle Shamhad, is a fearless campaigner against the Islamic Republic. And she recently had to receive the mutilated dead body of her father, who had been imprisoned by Iran, kidnapped, in fact. He was a German citizen and a resident in America. He was against the Islamic Republic regime. And as a result, when he was on an unexpected stopover during a flight in Dubai, they actually kidnapped him from Dubai, took him into Iran, kept him imprisoned there for years, torturing him, and eventually killed him, returning his body to Germany, where Giselle and the family received it to find that they had removed his tongue, I think his larynx, his heart. They had mutilated his body. Most of his teeth were gone. This is the behavior of that regime. And yet we have the United States at the moment in negotiations with them over their ambitions and program to achieve nuclear weapons. Of course, if they achieve nuclear weapons capability, which they've been trying to do for a very long time, all of these behaviors will be even harder to counter because they will be a nuclear state. And unlike in the past, where there's been this concept of mutually assured destruction, that states with nuclear weapons are unlikely to use them on one another, the idea of a regime that believes in this fantastical theory of chaos and destruction in the world bringing about this messianic period makes it all the more scary that they might actually use nuclear weapons. And so I think that all of these things combined, what I was trying to say in that column, should wake people up here in the UK, that even if you don't care about Israel and you don't care about Jews and you don't agree with Benjamin Netanyahu, there are very concrete and real things happening in the UK. I mean, we have people who've been taken hostage by Iran right now. There was a couple who were on a motorbike trip around the world, stopped in Iran, British couple, currently kidnapped and imprisoned there. We had, of course, the very famous case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, a dual national who went back to Iran to visit family and was imprisoned there for many years. Now, some people say, well, these people who are often dual nationals shouldn't go to Iran, but that's not really the answer. The answer is that this state engages in kidnapping, torture, imprisonment, extrajudicial imprisonment and killing in order to blackmail the West, and it works. So what I was trying to do in that column, and there's more in there, is just give all the examples I could think of how this is a British problem and how Britain needs to start to try to take measures, for example, prescribing the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They are a sort of second army of the Islamic Republic. There is the Iranian army, but then there is the Islamic Republic's own, the Revolutionary Guard, who are there to protect the revolutionary regime that has taken over. That is not prescribed as a terror group here in the UK. It is in America. So measures like that could be more positive ways that Britain could be trying to tackle this problem. And there are a whole host of others. But I was simply trying to highlight the problems and the proof that this is actually a very British problem as well as it is for Israel, which of course has a much more immediate fear of Iran's behaviors and nuclear capabilities.
Yeah, and Iran was always seen as like the big issue geopolitically for Israel and for Jews. But one other country that's kind of emerged onto the scene recently is Turkey. And I was, I don't know, I'd never really thought of Turkey in that way, particularly as they're a member of NATO. And yet we're seeing Erdogan giving safe refuge to Hamas leaders, inciting all this kind of genocidal language against Israel, and talking about destroying it, and talking about the Al-Aqsa flood and all of that. How much of a concern do you think Turkey is becoming now for Israel?
Well, Turkey is a concern for Israel, and over the years it's had varying relations with Turkey. So I think there have been times where the relationship's been more positive and times when it's been more negative. And we can think of moments like the Mavi Marmara flotilla that went to Gaza, and there was obviously Turkish influence with that. That was quite a low point. And Erdogan, of course, is keen to strengthen Islamic backing, Islamic thought, is Islamic rule in Turkey. And that's been the pattern of his leadership. So I think that part of that as well is that he has this kind of bigger vision of influence in the region. So now Turkey's influence in Syria is also of concern to Israel. The idea that al-Julani or al-Golani or whatever he's called this week, the Syrian jihadi interim leader who's just being entertained and received in France like he's some kind of normal state leader, is backed by Turkey. The idea that Turkey would then therefore have this serious presence that close to Israel in Syria is a concern. So I do think that Turkey is one to watch as well. We've heard Donald Trump talking about how he likes Erdogan and how he feels he can work with him in some of the balances in the region. As you say, Turkey, NATO member, and Turkey is in this unusual position where it is sometimes a useful player and sometimes quite a dangerous player. So you're right to highlight Turkey as a key part of this ever-evolving equation and a part of this very complex balance that's going on. And I'll say that more broadly, that's part of Israel's challenge, which is Israel has to have relations with its neighbors, either immediate or near, and it has to work out how to do that. Sometimes people have been critical of Israel for getting along with, in some way or another, quite tyrannical or dangerous regimes. But if it literally just decided that it is in a state of war or disagreement or conflict with literally every neighbor that isn't a liberal democracy, a sort of Western style presence in the Middle East like it is, then I think it would be completely doomed. There's a certain amount of realpolitik about how Israel has to behave, and indeed how the West has to behave. So Israel's part in the Abraham Accords, for example, making normalization deals with countries which aren't necessarily free and lovely places in the way that we might think Britain or America or Israel are, democracies with freedoms that those countries enjoy. It doesn't mean that Israel shouldn't try to find ways to get along with neighbors. And I think that could include Turkey as well. There are circumstances in which Israel could better its relationship with Turkey. But at the moment, that is definitely an area of concern.
Yeah, this really is. It's for me, it was a little surprising and definitely something that needs to be kept a close eye on. Last question before we wrap up, and it's really been an insightful discussion. Just circling back to the UK, because I know a lot of people have interest in what's going on here. In terms of British politics, what do you think about that? We're now seeing the emergence of a third party, Reform UK. And people are wondering, is that potentially going to change the state of play in Britain if they somehow increase their prominence? What's your analysis so far of that factor?
So the idea that there is now this sort of other option on the right in reform, which is really born of the Nigel Farage movement and the Brexit Party, and before that UKIP, they all have a common element, and that is Farage, but also not just Nigel, but the kind of ideology behind all three of those parties and behind the Brexit movement, and that is what today is called populism, right-wing populism, but that is often used as a pejorative, and I think that I understand why that is, but I would say that also it should be taken seriously, because the reason there's a popularity of parties like that, not just in the UK, but around the world, is that they respond to the very real concerns of quite a lot of people, what you might call regular people or ordinary people. I prefer just to call them British people. And a lot of those voters are concerned about immigration, illegal and legal, into the UK, about the strain or burden that puts on UK resources at a time when all sorts of things in the UK don't work that well, for example, the National Health Service. And the more that one takes in immigrants, the more that by definition will be burdened. So I think that parties like Reform do at least talk about those topics much more openly than the old parties, the Conservative and the Labour parties. But we live in a system in the UK where these old established parties have really been the entire game all along, and that's part of our system. So it is concerning to some that there's a challenger on the right, especially to people on the right, or at least people who don't like the Labour government and the left. And that's because in our system, it matters when you split a vote. So the idea that the Conservative Party, after 14 years in power, are not popular even among their own base, and therefore there is an alternative now, well, that by definition will split people between those who want to vote for the new alternative and those who think, well, the established party is still a safer place for my vote, still a safer place for putting the responsibility of running the country in their hands. And I don't know the answer to that at this stage. On the one hand, startups and new exciting movements can sometimes provide good answers. On the other hand, there is something to be said for experience, even if it's experience of an old and clunky and broken system. When it comes to governing the country, I think British people are naturally quite conservative with a small c. They like to do things gradually and slowly. We're not really a revolutionary nation or people. And there is something revolutionary about the popularity and rise in popularity of Reform UK. So for me, the jury's out. I don't know what to say about it. But as an analyst and an observer, I always say most of my job is seeing, identifying, analyzing, but not necessarily providing the answer. That frustrates some people. But I will say that this is definitely one to watch. And what happens with that fractured or divided right will be very important in the coming years when people do go to vote, whether or not they will entrust a brand new party of mostly people who have not got experience in politics or governing the country to do so. And how that will go if they do that is also unknown. And on the other hand, people are very, very disillusioned with the traditional old parties, and understandably and justifiably so. So it could be that Reform provides the fire underneath the existing parties to reform, reshape, and deal with these issues in a way that satisfies people. Or it could be that it is the new start, or the third option is that it just divides the vote and then keeps the power on the left for longer. And I don't yet know which of those, or maybe some other option I haven't thought about, will be the result. But it's definitely interesting. It's definitely not exclusive to the UK. I think it's something that we're seeing going on as well elsewhere in the world. I mean, even the re-election of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement has certain things in common as well.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I suppose we'll have to watch this space, as you say. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for making the time to speak to me on JTV. It's really appreciated. I have no doubt that our viewers are going to really appreciate your insights and analysis of all the issues we discussed. So just to end by saying thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
And hopefully we can have future discussions as well on the channel, because I really, really enjoyed this.
Great. It's been a pleasure, Ollie. Thanks a lot.
Imagine you live in a country the size of New Jersey or Wales, and on your border there are 50,000 armed militants with 150,000 rockets ready to destroy you. What do? You might turn to the ancient Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, who said all warfare is based on deception through espionage. Offer the enemy bait to lure him. On the 17th of September 2024, an enemy took the bait. A stunning undercover attack took place in Lebanon, targeting thousands of members of the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah. Who could have carried out such an unprecedented operation, and why? It was a sunny afternoon in Lebanon, a country on Israel's northern border. At 3:30 p.m, an astonishing attack from an invisible enemy shocked the country. Over 3,000 Hezbollah operatives received a message on their pages. As soon as they opened the message, a tiny hidden plastic explosive was ignited and the pages exploded. This is the stunning story of Mossad's insane operation.